Spine-chilling tales, dark stories, a nightmarish trip into the human psyche. This episode is something a little bit special. It's a brand new story I've been submitted, and as I know you're going to love this one, Creep fans, I submit for your approval this Creepypasta A Ghost Story by Jacob Gray. Rain and wind can make strange noises and blur our vision. In winter and at night when it's dark, the wind and rain can have an eerie effect. On a night in October, the rain was pouring hard and being whipped by the wind into little squalls. John Richmond was trying to hold on to his hat and move through the streets as quickly as he could. He wanted to get home. The orange glow of the street lamps reflected in the stormy puddles, and the car headlamps dazzled him. It was cold, and John was wearing the wrong jacket for such a wet night. He regretted not having taken a taxi. His home seemed further away than ever. It was nonsense at his age to think of saving a little money on a taxi fare and suffering in such terrible cold wet weather. There were few people out and about, and John eyed everyone with suspicion. The neighbourhood had changed for the worse, and John felt there were too many undesirables living nearby. He felt quite fearful. As he rounded the corner to the block of flats where he lived, John breathed a sigh of relief. He had made it home. He was wet and cold, and he'd need to get warm quickly. Next time, he'd take a taxi. The light was out in the path leading to the flat entrance. He'd phone up to complain about it in the morning. The leafless branches cast waving and strange shadows in the wet path. Something caught John's eye. He turned and glanced over his shoulder. He wasn't sure if there was someone there. It was late, and John got a slight fright, so he quickly entered the security door at the main entrance to his flat. He dodged inside into the brightly lit foyer and leant behind the door to assist it in closing. As the large solid wooden door clicked shut, John again breathed out a sigh of relief. Thud! John leapt forward. There was a bang against the door from outside. There must have been someone outside after all. With as much speed as he could, John ran up the stairs to his flat on the top floor. He was quite breathless by the time he reached his own flat door. His hands fumbled with his keys. Inside, John didn't put any lights on. He went to the intercom beside his door and lifted the telephone receiver and listened. There was no sound from downstairs at the main entrance. Only the wind could be heard. John went to the library to change his book. He had a list of titles he was reading his way through. Since Helen, his wife, had died, his days were long and empty. Reading staved off thinking about it. He left the library from its rear door and walked out onto the quiet street. There, as he adjusted his coat collar, he felt that same strange feeling. He turned and looked back. Was it that same person? The figure was almost distant and too shadowy to make out any features. How many times was it now the person had appeared? A person? John shook his head. If only it were a person. It was already getting dark and a fine misty rain had started. John took off in a hurry. He didn't glance back. John was on the bus back from the supermarket. He glanced out through the rain-covered windows. October was such a depressing month. It was grey and dismal. The rain never stopped. He rearranged his shopping bags that sat at his feet, and he worried about how much he'd spent. Then, as he was getting ready for his stop, he saw it again. It was standing motionless at the roadside. Cars and people were hurrying by, yet the figure stood, seemingly unnoticed by all except John. A menacing unease took hold of John, and he shut his eyes tightly. It was customary for John to drop in on a few of his fellow elderly neighbours. They were all lonely people. On the ground floor he liked to visit Mr. George Preston, with whom he'd play dominoes. As early as 9, it was time for John to head back up the stairs to his own flat. That night he had enjoyed 2 very fine malt whiskies with Mr. Preston as they played dominoes. John put his hand on the railing and pulled himself up the stairs. He noticed the light on the second floor hall landing was out. Then he noticed the noise of something. It was a stormy night, so he had to stop to concentrate and listen. It was footsteps, heavy-footed and slow. Who was coming up the stairs behind him? John panicked and he raced up the remaining stairs to his own flat, and he locked the door and put on the security chain. After a few days the weather improved and it stopped raining. A low grey cloud lay clamped over the town. John went about his daily business, but he was now feeling troubled. Would the ghastly person appear at some street corner and stand staring after him? With remarkable punctuality, John woke up every night at almost precisely 3:30 a.m. He was so used to this nightly interruption to his sleep that he had developed a regular strategy in coping with it. That night was the same as any other. He woke and switched on his dim bedside lamp. He sat up and his novel dropped from the bed to the floor. He'd lost his place in the book. John got up as usual and walked through his unlit flat to his kitchen to get a glass of cold water. He'd developed such a strong thirst through the night. The route to his kitchen was so familiar to him that he didn't ever need the light switched on. Yet, that was the night it happened. As he crossed his hallway, John always glanced to his front door. In the darkness, a familiar light shone from the hall outside and traced a line around the door frame. The spy hole in the centre of the door formed a perfect ball of light. There tonight, the light from behind the door was broken. In a paralysing moment of fear, John realised someone was standing behind his door. Something was standing close behind his door, their feet touching the frame. Whoever it was, whatever it was, it stood silent, motionless and listening. John was terrified. He couldn't move. He didn't let the person know he was awake and watching. In the engulfing silence, John knew he had to take a look. He wanted to know who it was that had been following him, or what it was. He'd creep to the spy hole and identify them, then phone for the police for help, and wait safely locked in his flat until they arrived. With great caution, John noiselessly edged towards his front door. The definite shadow of a figure stood casting its shadow. John paused. He had to summon all his courage to look. He drew a silent, deep breath and put his eye up to the spy hole. He stared in amazement. There was no one there. He stared through the spy hole, which gave a clear view of the hall landing outside. There was nobody there. The hall was lit and no one could have darted from the door in such a short time. Was it all imagination? What had cast the shadow against the door? John stepped back from his front door. He had calmed down and was hoping he had dreamt the whole thing. As he stepped back, he stared at the light that surrounded the frame of the hall door. The shadow was there. Someone or something had stepped back against the door. Thud! The door banged from outside. John shook his head. His body was paralysed with fear. He looked at the door and saw that he hadn't fastened the chain. Thud! John leapt to the door and stared through the spy hole. There was nobody there. He stepped back into his dark hallway. Suddenly the door handle shook violently. John felt faint. He hadn't locked the door, and the handle was turning open.